As the saying goes, a man's home is his castle.
There is no one factor more representative of the economic well-being of the American citizen than the home in which he lives.
It's not just the American dream. Across the rich world, people have been told they should be buying their own home.
Now's the time to buy a home.
Get on the housing ladder.
Starting from under $60,000.
Help to Buy is helping people get their foot on the housing ladder.
Owning a home is a part of that dream.
But why is there this pressure to get on the property ladder?
People don't really question the idea that home ownership is a good thing. It's something that they've always been told and assume it must be true.
The obsession with home ownership has had unintended consequences, which have not only distorted the housing market, but brought the financial system to its knees.
The realization of the American dream, the envy of the entire world.
This is Tim. He rents in London. This is Diana. She rents in Zurich. Tim is 30 and works in sales, and he's desperate to get on the property ladder.
It's incredibly frustrating not to be able to own something of your own.
But Diana is in no such rush.
I've been renting for the whole 20 years since I came to Switzerland.
Diana rents this apartment with her twin sons and her partner.
Oder bist du denn Dino? Der Flug ist super.
She works as a lecturer at a university.
We've been here for 3 years and it's really home for us.
Switzerland has one of the world's most competitive economies, and the people who live here enjoy a very high quality of life. You'd think that would mean that most people would own their own home. Far from it. At 38%, Switzerland has the lowest home ownership rate in the OECD, a group of mostly rich countries. In Britain, it's much higher. 2/3 of houses are owned by the people who live in them. According to the Economist's House Price Index, the Swiss housing market is considerably more stable than Britain's. A house in Switzerland is worth just 70% more today than it was in 1970. In Britain, prices have increased by 346% in the same period. There's evidence to show that ownership rates and market volatility are connected. To understand why, we need to go back 100 years. At the beginning of the 20th century, the majority of people in Britain, America, and other developed countries were renters. In Britain, for example, just 1 in 4 families owned their own home. But after the Second World War, many governments across the rich world made a monumental shift in policy. They decided to create nations of homeowners.
The idea was that if you're a homeowner, when you retire, you can sell your home and you can maybe live off the proceeds of that, or if you lose your job, then at least you've got some assets which you can sell.
Policies such as low interest loans, tax breaks on mortgages, and relief on capital gains tax were put in place to promote home ownership.
All of which add up to quite a big kind of, in effect, a subsidy from the government for home ownership.
From the 1950s, home ownership shot up, as did the amount of money banks gave in mortgages. By 2008, mortgage lending was worth 63% of rich countries' GDP. But in the long run, this new world of homeowners created more problems than it solved.
Financial catastrophe triggered. No one, it seems, can stop the bleeding.
The big, massive global financial crisis of 10 years ago was a housing crisis.
As homeowners defaulted on their mortgages at record rates, it was clear trouble was...
For a lot of people in America, they thought they were making a sensible financial decision by becoming homeowners, and that turned out to be completely wrong.
The crash was a disastrous consequence of the home ownership boom. But the damage caused by encouraging people to buy their own houses runs far deeper than financial crises.
The fundamental problem is to do with lack of supply. The whole rich world today builds like half the houses per person than it did in the 1960s. The decline in construction has been kind of concentrated in the parts of the country where you'd most like it to increase. So in those like rich, dynamic, productive, cool cities.
Since the first day I arrived in London, I've been looking at house prices. I think there's an innate human drive to own something and to call it your own.
But when people do buy their own home, they're more likely to resist further development in their area. Christian Hilber has extensively researched the impact of this mentality.
In a country where the home ownership rate is very high, homeowners are so-called NIMBYs, not in my backyard residents. They try to protect their asset values by limiting new supply. They vote for politicians that enforce restrictive planning that leads to unresponsive supply. So if the economy is booming and supply cannot respond, it raises prices a lot. So in countries like the UK or the US, where home ownership rates are fairly high, these countries tend to have policies that favor home ownership and tend to have planning systems that lead to inflexible supply.
There's always this question of, we'd like housing for young people, but we're not going to let it ruin our neighbourhood. And I think this mentality, this snobbery, is absolutely out of control. That has to change because people in the millennial generation aren't able to get the basics they need in life, such as a house.
The failure to build, in particular in cities, has also held back productivity and harmed economies.
When you've got expensive housing, it means it's hard for people to move to those cities. And when it's hard for people to move to those cities, it means that they struggle to get the jobs that they want. And what that basically does is constrains the growth of the overall economy.
Home buyers are less likely to become entrepreneurs and less willing to move to find work. Research has shown that historically, an increase in home ownership in America has been followed by a sharp rise in unemployment as people are reluctant to relocate to find a new job. The financial crisis put an end to the growing rate of homeowners. Weak earnings growth and tighter restrictions on mortgages have made it much harder for people like Tim to get on the housing ladder. Politicians are worried about declining home ownership.
We're helping every American find their path to the American dream.
But in fact, having more renters may not be such a bad thing.
There's this perception across much of the world that home owning is better than renting. It creates a more stable, better society. In reality, there's only very weak evidence that home ownership kind of creates better citizens.
Supporters of home ownership often cite Singapore as an example of a highly stable country where ownership is high. There, 91% of the population own their own home, and it comes 9th in the world on the UN's Human Development Index. But if we look at Romania, there the home ownership rate is even higher, but it comes much lower in the world in terms of development. Which brings us back to Switzerland. Here, few own their own homes. Yet it's one of the most developed countries in the world. Switzerland also has a system which benefits renters like Diana. Renters' rights are protected, leases can last as long as 20 years, and prices are stable.
In all those years, we had never get an increased price. Even once, you could make a request to our landlord to reduce the price because the reference interest rates were also reduced, and according to the law, we just wrote a letter, very short, and 3 months later, we got a new lower price. I think Switzerland is special with regard to his rental law. I wouldn't feel so secure in another country.
Renters feel very insecure in this country. We don't feel we're getting a good deal. We don't feel we're getting good value for money. My main incentive for wanting to buy a property is to stop throwing away money every month on rent.
This is a common argument against renting, but is it true? In 2018, renters across most of the rich world did spend more on rent than homeowners spent on mortgage repayments. But to see the full picture, we need to look at all the costs over a longer period. Let's imagine someone choosing between renting or buying in Britain. If they decided to rent, they would give one payment to a landlord every month. But if they decided to buy, their costs would include mortgage repayments, plus interest, which can fluctuate, and then a whole host of additional costs, such as transactional costs, buildings insurance and maintenance.
Once you add up all of those costs, there are times when renting's a better deal and there's times when home ownership is a better deal, and that depends quite a lot on the interest rate in the economy. But both the theory and the evidence suggest that renting and buying a property end up costing about the same amount kind of over the long run. The question of which is better ultimately comes down to a personal preference, but the idea that one is inherently and objectively better than the other is not true.
Investing in bricks and mortar isn't always a safe bet. While many have gained from increasing house values since the 70s, those who piled into the American housing market at the peak of the bubble lost out. Despite this, rich world governments continue to invest in promoting home ownership. In America and in many other countries, there is what's known as mortgage interest deduction. This is where homeowners can offset the interest on their mortgage against income tax.
The US spends about $100 billion a year on the mortgage interest deduction in the form of foregone tax revenue, and the net effect of the policy on home ownership is essentially zero.
Christian also looked at a British policy called Help to Buy, which is a form of equity loan from the government.
The Help to Buy policy is a very ineffective policy. We found that Help to Buy in the Greater London Authority increased house prices by more than the implied subsidy, and it didn't lead to any new housing construction.
The case for the government spending all this money on promoting home ownership is quite weak, and they could be putting that money towards education or transport or healthcare.
Rather than creating a stable society, home ownership has been the West's biggest economic policy mistake. Attempts are being made to redress the balance. America has capped its tax break on mortgage interest deduction, and Britain has banned letting agents from charging renters' fees. But that's not enough. It's time to build an entirely new housing market, one that actually works.
I'm Anna, I directed this film. If you'd like to learn more about the mistakes governments have made when it comes to housing, you can click on the link opposite. That will take you to a special report by Callum Williams and also some of the data and research we used whilst making this film. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.